Welcome to the Washington Times. A lot to chat with you about today. I want to talk about the Declaration of Independence because this document, it's something that a lot of children are taught about in schools, and we sort of just glaze over it, but there's so much incredible history here. And I want to start with a general question, and I always love getting your perspective because you have such a penchant for taking us through history in unique ways. With that in mind, what makes the Declaration of Independence, in your view, so unique?
Well, if we zoom out and look at all the world history, it's all kings. Nimrod, Pharaoh, Caesar, Kaiser, Sultan, Tsar. And as the centuries go on, the kingdoms get bigger because with the latest military advancement, kings can kill more people. So instead of Cain killing Abel with a rock, they can kill with a bronze weapon, an iron weapon, a phalanx spear the Greeks had, scimitar sword that the Muslims had. The weapon keeps improving, but it's that same fallen nature of Cain killing Abel. And it's a gang structure. Kings are just glorified gang leaders. If you're friends with the king, you're more equal. If you're not friends with the king, you're less equal. If you're an enemy of the king, you're dead. It's called treason, or you're a slave. And as the centuries go on, these kingdoms get bigger until the King of England was the biggest. The sun never set on the British Empire. He had India, Bengal, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, Jamaica, countries from Khartoum and Sudan down to South Africa and Egypt. The British Empire was a global empire. The King of England was a globalist, and America's founders did not like globalists telling us what to do, so they broke away and flipped it and made the people the king.
Yeah. Can I ask you something about that? Because what you just said is so interesting. They broke off. They made the people the king. And I'll let you finish your thought there in a minute, but that is really, in light of what you just described, such a paradigm shift. Had the world seen anything like that before at that point in history?
The biggest example was ancient Israel. When they came out of Egypt around 1400 BC, you had millions of people and no king. And it worked for 400 years. Everybody's taught the law, and everybody's personally accountable to God to follow it. And it only really works with the God of the Bible. Athens had a democracy, but Plato said it's based on virtue and people really don't have virtue. They didn't have an accountability. What are you going to be accountable to? Get the goddess of love, Aphrodite, where her temple has temple prostitutes? There's really not the concept of a just God. It's fickle gods that you have to appease. But in Israel's case, they had a law and everybody was accountable to God to follow it. And it worked for 400 years until the priests went woke. You say, what? Yeah, here's Eli, the high priest. His own sons are sleeping with women in the tent where the Ark of the Covenant is. And it turns into chaos. They all go to Samuel the prophet and they say, we want to be like the other countries. We want a king. Now, why is this story important? Kings of England looked to the Bible for their authority, but they looked to the King Saul and on part of the Bible. Divine right of kings, I'm the royal gang leader appointed by God. And the Puritans that founded New England looked to the pre-King Saul part of the Bible, the Hebrew Republic. That's why they taught Hebrew at Yale and Harvard. And so this was like the big major example that the founders of America looked back to. And they did mix it in a little Athenian democracy. They did mix in a little Roman Republic, but ultimately it was ancient Israel. And that's why there is a key line in the Declaration. All men are endowed by their creator with inalienable rights. This skips the king. The king said the king is endowed with all the rights. He's God's lieutenant. He's God's intermediary. He's the divine right of kings, and he appoints and gives these rights to subjects who are subjected to his will. He's like the intermediary. We skip the intermediary. We skip the king. We say the creator gives the rights to each person. And since the God of the Bible is not a respecter of persons, we're all created equal. The King of England did not believe that. He believed he was created a little extra special, right?
I have to ask you this, though, because it's okay. The Declaration of Independence, what you're describing right now, obviously mentioning God repeatedly, that seemed really important to the founders. Now, you mentioned the kings looking, obviously, to the Bible for their authority from the kings on, which I think, from Saul on, which I think is very interesting. But it seemed like there was a different approach. I mean, they could have left God entirely out of the Declaration, but they're even indicating that the rights come from God, that they don't come from any other man. Why was that important to the founders? Why was that specific inclusion, mentioning God at least 4 times, I believe, there in the document, such an essential thing for them as they were making such a bold proclamation?
Yeah, so we go to the Reformation, we go to John Calvin, and he writes, "We are subject to the men who rule over us, but subject only in the Lord. If they command anything against him, let us not pay the least regard to it." In other words, we'll obey the king as long as the king is submitted to God. It's sort of like Ephesians 6, children obey your parents. But what if there's a bad parent who tells the kid to kill the neighbor and sell themselves into prostitution? Is the child supposed to obey that parent? No. The child obeys the parent as long as the parent's telling them to do something that lines up with God's word. You obey the government, the king, as long as the king's telling you to do something that lines up with God's word. And so that influenced John Calvin, influenced the Puritans, influenced the Dutch Reformed, influenced the Pilgrims and the Baptists and Quakers, and lots of other denominations drew from that thought that since the King of England, and so the Declaration lists 27 reasons why the king had stopped being a representative of God. And so Thomas Jefferson writes in the beginning of the Declaration, he says, realizing in the future people will wonder why we did this. He lists 27 reasons. And that the king has made judges dependent on his will alone. So instead of the judges guaranteeing to you your creator-given rights, the judges are just enforcers of the king and his deep state. He says the king has erected multitude of new offices, sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people, eat them out of the substance. He's kept standing armies. He's quartered soldiers in our homes because there were no barracks, so they would sleep in your beds and eat your food, imposing taxes on us without our consent, depriving us of the benefit of a trial by a jury. It was just like a January 6th hearing. You go before the government person and they throw you in jail. And then it's interesting. He plundered our seas, ravaged our coast, burnt our town, destroyed our lives. You go to Maine, Portland, Maine. The king had his ships shoot cannons and set the whole city on fire. And then he transported large armies. And then this is interesting. It says he has excited domestic insurrection among us and has endeavored to bring the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages and sexes and conditions. So General Johnny Burgoyne of the British meets with the Mohawk Indians, who had sort of got to an equilibrium with the settlers. They were getting along, and he stirs them up and promises them money for scalps. And so they would begin to scalp Americans. And so the Thomas Jefferson, the king is 38 years old, King George, and Thomas Jefferson is 33 years old. And so Jefferson pens the Declaration. And it's interesting, excuse me, Jefferson's original draft got rid of slavery.
Yeah, okay. This blew my mind when I heard this because I did not know that there was an original line in the Declaration of Independence, because we have so much debate and discussion about why a country, here you have a Declaration of Independence declaring that rights come from God, declaring that God is sovereign, essentially, and then you have slavery obviously being something that, in the final draft is not condemned, but there was a line condemning slavery that was removed for the final version. Take us through what happened there, because that is an incredible piece of history there.
Yeah, so the Quakers settled Pennsylvania, and they're the ones that pioneered the anti-slavery movement. And they had a petition in 1688 to end slavery, so the Quakers are officially against it. Everybody's equal, and so the blacks, a lot of them became Quakers. And Anthony Benezet wrote a book on the horrors of the slave trade, and people began to read it, including Patrick Henry. And he says, I can no longer defend slavery. Anyway, many colonies tried to get rid of slavery before the Revolution, but the King of England stopped them. Why? The Royal African Company. The king was a part owner of the Royal African Company that made money off of slavery. And so Thomas Jefferson writes this in the original draft of the Declaration. The king has waged cruel war against human nature itself in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in the transportation thither, suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this exorable commerce, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold.
Wow.
South Carolina and Georgia said no to that line. And since they had agreed that the declaration needed to be unanimous, and since they just got word that the British had invaded New York and they were all panicking, they said, well, we'll deal with slavery later. Let's hurry up and pass this. How we wish they would have fought it out and kept that line in there and ended slavery right then and there.
100 years more, right? Of practically 100 years more before there's a war than tearing the country apart to deal with this very issue. But also you mentioned you have the issue going on in New York City. You have the attack in New York City. You have this panic of we need to move forward and get this going so that we can deal with the bigger issue of actual, declaring our independence. That is a really shocking piece of history. Is it surprising to you when people don't know much about that? Because I honestly did not know that history.
Yep, a few do. Now, they did put into the Constitution that as of 1807, no more slaves would be imported into America. And interestingly enough, Thomas Jefferson was the president in 1807, and he signed the legislation to prohibit further importation of slaves. Unfortunately, the ones that were here weren't freed yet. 1807 is the same year that William Wilberforce stopped the slave trade in the British Empire. It took 33 more years for William Wilberforce in England to get the slaves to be freed. But unfortunately, in America, we had the South being Democrat and pro-slavery. The North were Whigs, W-H-I-G-S. That was the opposition party of the king, but then that was sort of the party considered sort of opposition in America. And they wanted to be a big tent party. And finally, they dissolved. And in 1854, a slave escaped from St. Louis, Missouri, went to Racine, Wisconsin. And the sheriff of Missouri, under the Fugitive Slave Law Act that the Democrats had pushed through Congress, went to Racine, Wisconsin, bribed somebody to show him where the guy's living, takes his rifle and butts him in the face, knocks him out, puts him in the back of a wagon, takes him to Milwaukee and puts him in jail, and is going to take him back to St. Louis. But 5,000 white Wisconsins storm the Milwaukee jail, and they free Joshua Glover, the slave, and help him escape to Canada. And then just a couple days later, those same Wisconsins meet in Ripon, Wisconsin, and form the Republican Party. And the founding platform is to eliminate the twin relics of barbarism, slavery and polygamy that was going on in Utah at the time. And so now this is 1854, and Lincoln is the first Republican president. And what does he do? Free the slaves. And so, but we wish they would have ended slavery right there at the beginning, but you had greed. I tell people there's two threads that trace through history: greed and the gospel. You always have people motivated by the gospel, and they're the ones that dig wells in villages and build medical clinics and collect shoes and give them to poor people and hospitals and everything. And you always have people motivated by greed, like the British East India Company grew opium in India and forced it onto China, called their Century of Humiliation. But they're people that sold people into slavery. And they cut through each of our hearts every day. We have to make decisions. Are we going to make a selfish, greedy decision? Or are we going to stand up and do what's right and help other people?
So, yeah, I mean, and as you're describing that in this history, I mean, here we are, we're celebrating this, we're preparing for America 250, right? We're, at this really interesting place in, our culture and our history right now. And there's so much happening in America today, particularly on the faith front. There's been a lot of debate, a lot of haggling back and forth over the founders and which ones were Christians and which ones weren't, and what role did they really want God to have. It's hard to look at the Declaration of Independence and to look at other founding documents and assume that all of these people, and of course, every human being is different throughout the history of the world, including today, that all of them either were or weren't believers. But it seems like when you look at these documents, there was an importance that was being placed on God and him being the source of goodness and truth. Can you speak to that when it comes to the founders, when it comes to the Declaration, when it comes to the formation of America, how important it was to them to have some reliance on a higher power.
Right. So every colony was started by a different Christian denomination. Virginia was Anglican. You had to be Anglican in Virginia. You had to take the oath of supremacy if you wanted to be involved in Virginia government. Massachusetts was Puritan. Rhode Island was Baptist. Maryland was Catholic. New Hampshire and Connecticut were Congregationalist. New York was Dutch Reformed. Delaware and New Jersey were originally Swedish Lutheran. Then they became Dutch Reformed, and then they were taken over by the British, right? The Carolinas were Anglican, but then when they got a new governor that wanted to tighten the screws, South Carolina split away and said, no, we want to be plain Protestant. And then Pennsylvania was Quaker. And Pennsylvania, William Penn let any Christian of any denomination come in there, even Catholics and even Jews. And so Pennsylvania was where they met to write the Declaration of Independence. All the other representatives felt comfortable coming there. And so when they came, who were they? Well, about 2/3 of the founders were Anglican, and then Presbyterian, and then a couple Lutheran, a couple Baptists, a couple Dutch Reformed, Quaker, and then one Catholic, Baptist, right? So they were different denominations. And then when they did the Constitution, their concern was they did not want one particular denomination to be chosen as the national denomination, which is what every other country in the world did. And so they wanted to limit the federal government and keep religion under the state's jurisdiction. So I read through every state constitution. 9 of the original 13 state constitutions required office holders to be Protestant. We think of that as narrow-minded. They thought they were being generous because by saying Protestant, you could be Lutheran and Baptist and Methodist and Episcopal, right? 3 states said all you had to do was be a plain Christian. And interestingly enough, 1 state had 0 religious requirements, Rhode Island, founded by Baptists. And they said if you required someone to be a Christian just to get elected, they could say they were even if they weren't just to get elected, and that would be hypocritical. So just vote for the best Christian person you know. And so that was the country at the founding. And then, an Irish potato famine, millions of Irish Catholics come across in the early 1800s. Catholic population goes from 1% to 20%. Persecution of Jews in Bavaria, middle 1800s, they go from 0.1% to 1% of the population. Eventually they tolerated any faith. And ironically, now they seem to be tolerating every faith except the Christians, right? Kicking them out. But you go back to the founders, they were all Christians of different denominations. Ben Franklin, who could be considered maybe one of the more liberal, he was raised Presbyterian. And he said that the different doctrines of predestination he could never understand. And he says, I wish the religion had more producing of good works. So he started hospitals and he started all kinds of stuff. And but he said he stood up for a preacher named Samuel Hemphill, who was a New Light preacher that was talking about, really applying your faith. And he said he was a great preacher, but a bad writer. So I lent him my pen. So Ben Franklin wrote a half a dozen articles for this preacher, and they're all evangelical. They're all Bible-based. They're all really solid. Unfortunately, that preacher got voted out of the church, and that's when Jefferson decided to absent himself from service. He said, the new preacher came and visited me. I went to church 5 Sundays in a row, and all he did was talk about the finer points of the doctrines of our denomination. And he says, I found it rather boring, and so he continued to contribute. But he, didn't go to it. So if that's a deist, now even John and Abigail Adams, the thought of deism sort of came out of embracing all Christian faith. So George Whitefield would preach the Great Awakening Revival, and he would say, there's freedom for all. When we get to heaven, we're going to lay aside our badges of schism, and we're just going to be believing in Jesus. And so it was sort of like, hey, you mean we have something in common more than just our denomination. And so that was more of a Christian deism that came out of that. But then gradually you had people like Abigail Adams. She said, yeah, I'm a Unitarian. I believe that Jesus is the Son of God and he is divine. He is just not completely equal with the Father. It's like, that's a Unitarian back then. Now, it's gotten to the place where you hug trees and everybody's a god. So you sort of can see that back then they were all immersed in Christian teaching, and they wanted to, as Jefferson talked about, believe that rights come from a creator and that the government is not to violate your freedom of choice, your free conscience. Why? Because of love. God loves you, wants you to love him back, but for love to be loved, it must be voluntary. God's not pleased by you saying you believe something, but you really don't. You just don't want to be burned at the stake.
Yeah.
You want to take away the government so that there'd be this freedom of conscience so you could voluntarily love God back.
Well, my final question for you, I mean, you're somebody who, you've looked so deeply at history, and I could talk to you for hours about all of this, but when you look at America today, at the formation of America, particularly the Declaration, the early years of this country, it's hard not to look at it, at least from my perspective, as somebody who's not a historian, and say, I mean, it feels miraculous in so many ways that the way this all happened, the growth of the country, where we are. What role do you think God's hand has had in the formation? That's not to say America's perfect, that we haven't done horrible things, but what I'm saying is the formation of the country against all odds, it feels almost miraculous in some ways.
Yeah, and the founders acknowledged that. Again, we were fighting the biggest military on the planet. And you have the Battle of Brooklyn Heights. 3,000 Americans died, only 300 British. And then Washington's pinned up against the water and the sun goes down. And he's probably thinking the next day he'll be hung and America will be another colony like, Sudan or something. But instead they have a day of fasting. I thought this was fascinating. The same Continental Congress that did the Declaration of Independence 2 months earlier unanimously passed a day of fasting and prayer to Almighty God. We earnestly recommend the 17th of May, 1776, to be observed as a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer. And it says, by sincere repentance and amendment of life, appease God's righteous displeasure, and through the merits and mediation of Jesus Christ, obtain pardon and forgiveness.
Wow.
I mean, this is unanimously passed just 2 months before they passed the Declaration. These were Christian men that met, and they had this faith that, and they realized it after every battle. So Washington got every boat he could find, ferried his men across the East River, only got half across when the sun started to come up. Now he's a sitting duck. And his chief of intelligence, Major Ben Talmadge, said, as the dawn of the next day approached, those of us who remained in the trenches became very anxious for our own safety. And when the dawn appeared, there were several regiments still on duty. At this time, a very dense fog began to rise off the river and settle in a peculiar manner over both encampments. I recollect this peculiar providential occurrence perfectly well. And so very dense was the atmosphere that you could scarcely discern a man at 6 yards distance. The fog remained as dense as ever, right? But then around noon, Washington's on the last boat that leaves. The fog lifts. The British charge. Nobody's there. That was the last chance the British had to capture the entire American army all at once.
Wow.
And then you have Benedict Arnold. He was the hero of the Battle of Saratoga, passed over for some promotions because the Continental Congress said, okay, we want to have generals promoted equally from the different colonies. And Benedict Arnold was from Rhode Island, and they'd already had a bunch of generals from Rhode Island, so he's not being promoted. And people that were under him are now being over him, and he gets miffed. He marries a girl, Peggy Shippen, who's in Philadelphia, whose father is under the table loyalist, and he didn't know that, but she keeps nagging him for a year, saying, these Americans don't appreciate you. If you were in the British Army, they would know what a great guy you are. After a year, she convinces him to meet with a British spy, John Andre. And by this time, he's in charge of West Point. So he's going to surrender West Point to the British on the very day George Washington is coming to investigate and check out West Point. And so Arnold meets with the British spy. John Andre gives him a map of West Point and then goes back. He's waiting for Washington. Well, the spy gets caught. And they're searching him, and they search him once, twice, and they make him take off his boot. And in the stocking is the map of West Point. And the guards say, what about this? And he tries to talk his way out. They say, well, let's let you explain it to our commander. Word gets back to Benedict Arnold. He flees on a ship called the Vulture. And all of a sudden it becomes clear. And so Nathaniel Greene, the general, said, treason of the blackest dye was yesterday discovered. General Arnold, who commanded at West Point, was about to give the American cause a deadly wound, if not fatal stab. Happily, the treason had been timely discovered to prevent the fatal misfortune. This providential train of circumstances which led to its discovery affords the most convincing proof that the liberties of America are the object of divine protection. So the founders over and over again said, look, even Ben Franklin, when he was, they were doing the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War, which starts off in the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity. And then they're doing the Constitution. And Ben Franklin stands up and he goes, during our contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this assembly for divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard and they were graciously answered. Many of us who were involved in the contest must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. Wow. So they realized that God was involved in this. Against the most powerful military in the world. And we had like a ragtag, threw together a Navy. It was 6 ships that George Washington personally financed called the Washington's cruisers, and then we didn't have a standing army until Baron von Steuben comes over and starts training our men. And then Spain, people don't realize the King of Spain, Carlos III, created a front company in Paris called Rodrigo Hortalez and Company. And Spain is funneling millions of dollars financing our Revolutionary War. People don't realize Spain paid for this. And then the King of Spain has his governor of New Spain, Bartolome de Galvez, Bernardo de Galvez. And Bernardo de Galvez is who Galveston's named after. And so he drives the British out of Pensacola, out of Baton Rouge, out of Mobile, captures their supplies, yet he allows supplies from the Dutch and others to come up the Mississippi to George Rogers Clark to give Washington's troops from behind, and then the ladies of Havana. So Rochambeau, the French admiral, is coming across to help. Ben Franklin finally talked the king into sending help. And he stops off in Cuba. And when word gets out that he's going to help the Americans, the ladies of Havana give their jewelry, their candelabras, their silverware, $28 million worth. And they put it in a big chest. And Rochambeau takes it and gives it to Washington. Washington throws his hat in the air. And in the memoirs of Rochambeau in the Library of Congress, it says the money from the ladies of Havana buoyed up the Continental Army, which was on the verge of dissolving. Right? They were like about to all go home. And but who would have thought that here Cuba and Mexico and helped America to become independent from Britain. So a fascinating thing that took place that truly we have to acknowledge that God's hand was involved in this.
Miracle after miracle after miracle. I really appreciate you, as always, breaking it down. What an interesting history to go through, especially as we are really celebrating the country, not only during this time of year in July, obviously, but also looking ahead to America 250 and digging deeper into all of this incredible history. Appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you, Billy.